Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the death of Hollywood, or at the very least, what now appears to be the inevitable death of Hollywood. And while I will concentrate on talking about it in terms of Hollywood, I think this is true for any large storytelling mechanism right now. Whether that be the comic industry or Walt Disney as a company, doesn't matter. And really, the point of why I think these storytelling mechanisms are dying is because storytelling is first and foremost, at its core, reliant upon trust. And these centers of movie making or companies or industries simply are not trusted anymore. Now, I'll stop right there for a second and say if you want some good storytelling based upon the traditional ways of telling a story, merit based art and storytelling, I have two links in the description for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 low fantasy graphic novel. You're looking at some of the art for those in the background. And if you want to know more, I'll be playing a trailer for one of those graphic novels after I'm done of this video at the very end. And also, very briefly, I'm gearing up to publish, most probably as part of a subscription to this channel, a webcomic that will be coming out in small chapters every few weeks. And if you want to learn more or hear more about what I have to say, concentrate it more on art and art style and things like that. I do a live stream on Wednesday evenings, typically between either 8:30 and 9:30 or 9:30 and 10:30, depending on the week. Oh, that's Eastern Standard Time, by the way. But all that out of the way, I'll just remind you about those 2 links in the description. So if my content appeals to you, you might want to click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. But back to the topic. Now, I started to think about this topic because, well, Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter is having a bit of a tiff with his audience because they are rejecting wholeheartedly institutions of storytelling like Hollywood, like the comic industry, and it's his basic position that you can't reject the entire thing. There's too much experience there. We need to take it back over and go back to using those industries once more. And you do that slowly but surely by trusting some of the products that they have. And a lot of his audience is saying, no, I don't trust any of the products that they have. Now, I can see both sides of this argument, I think, very well. And I want to talk about, at the very least, at the end, when I go through this entire thing, why exactly that is. Why exactly Richard has this mentality and why exactly a lot of his audience has the opposite of that mentality. And really, I think this was good for me because I get to understand for myself, as someone who sells graphic novels, what and how the audience thinks, what they're looking for, and really, it brings my point back home to me once again that if you want to bring that trust back, you have to concentrate now on something much more primal, something much more natural, something that is ingrained in the human nature. And that's why I go back to heroism and the idea of a true hero, because I think those things, certainly as they are portrayed within the historic Western civilization, those things like heroism and virtue that builds up heroism are those things that go back to the very basis of trust for human beings and why they're looking for things like stories. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to start from a seemingly very odd place, which again is where my mind goes because everything is connected to story. So that odd place is the idea of entropy. Now, I became, well, sort of obsessed with the idea of entropy for a couple of years when I was a teenager, really. If I remember correctly, it was because I was introduced to the idea through comics. It was the story arc of Green Lantern where Hal Jordan went mad and he took over all the rings from all the other Green Lanterns. And around that same time, there was also a mini series of graphic novels called The Books of Magic, done by DC Comics, which also incorporated that idea. You had stories like Mr. E, Black Orchid, a bunch of others, but they were trying to teach this child about the mystical part of the universe. Anyways, they took him into the very, very far future where the Earth did still exist, but it was covered with uniformly about a foot of water, and the quote unquote humans that lived on it were nothing but what we think of as early sci-fi aliens, and they just hunted spiders in order to eat, and that's all they did. So basically, humankind had degraded to a point of animalistic absurdity, so to speak. But what does this all have to do with entropy? Well, what is entropy to begin with? Well, it's basically the idea of the heat death of the universe. The idea that things will get more and more chaotic and tend towards death and destruction more and more. The reason why it was grasped on at that time, I think, by science fiction and fantasy is because it originally, if I remember correctly, originates from a scientific idea of the heat death of the universe. The idea of the Big Bang used to be that there was this spectacular explosion of matter and energy from this one source, and it went outwards, and it was going to stop at some point expanding and then start coming back in on itself to where it will join together once again as the big crunch and then bang out once again. And that is what the universe does every once in a while. And, once in a while, I mean, trillions and trillions of years, if not more. And comics has been obsessed a little bit with this idea for quite some time. That's the idea of where Galactus came from. But anyway, and quite honestly, I connect this kind of idea, the way I understand it now anyways, with one of the essays of that great author C.S. Lewis. Lewis has this essay called, I think, The Death or the Eulogy of an Idea. And what he's eulogizing is the idea of materialistic evolution. Like the idea of entropy, which originated supposedly out of a scientific idea and then went into storytelling, he's saying the same thing, sort of, about materialistic evolution. He's saying, first of all, no, it wasn't a scientific idea that was taken over by poets and storytellers. Quite the opposite. In his estimation, it was an idea which permeated storytelling and poetry and then became expressed in a scientific idea. And his estimation of that is going back to stories like Siegfried and how there was this story idea that there is no meaning. Everything just came about by random chance. This kind of destiny will eventually lead us to overthrow the gods themselves and become godlike in our own prowess. But at the same time, the tragic end of the entire thing is uselessness, because nature itself, that old enemy of mankind, no matter how godlike we become, will eventually destroy us and bring us to nothing. So everything's just futile. And really, materialism, if you believe in pure materialism, that's where your mind, if you are logically consistent, needs to go to. Everything is random chance. You have no free will. There is no meaning whatsoever. Everything is useless. And again, I would say that mimics the sort of idea which was expressed in the books of magic. That's what eventually becomes of humanity, even though human beings have become this godlike thing within superheroes. Now, all of this does connect, obviously, when you go back to pure materialism, with the quote-unquote progressive ideas that you see around you today, because they go back to pure materialism. But we'll put a pin in that for the moment, because I want to talk about another idea that I encountered when I was in university that counters the idea of entropy. It's the idea of neg entropy. And the idea of neg entropy is, well, if the universe is going to continue to expand and expand to the point of nothing more than chaos, because even atoms themselves will be so scattered away from each other that they will exist in a sea of nothingness, where even gravity itself doesn't have any sway, because again, it's all about that initial gravity of the Big Bang being dispersed to a point of nothingness, which is seen as chaos. Neg entropy is again a scientific idea that says, no, even if that were to happen, there's going to be pockets of gravity that are going to draw in more and more of these atoms, more and more of the universe, even though it will be slow and laborious, but it will happen. And you will get these small pockets of the universe that will exist within this vast nothingness. But those small pockets themselves will be quite ordered. And while on the whole, this massive disorder will continue to disperse itself into nothingness, these small pockets of gravity will ensure the continuation of the universe in these, again, more and more ordered rather than chaotic parts of the universe. Now, why am I talking about entropy and neg entropy and all this kind of thing? Well, because you can apply this same principle to the idea of storytelling, because the gravity for storytelling is trust. The gravity really for any society itself is trust. And as I did a video on it a couple of weeks ago, what your quote-unquote progressives seek to do is to destroy that trust within your society in an attempt to destroy the society itself. But the thing is, their ideas proceed, at the very least according to the traditional way of thinking within Western civilization, they proceed upon a false assumption. And that false assumption is that human beings are atomistic in their nature. That is to say, the basic unit of society, the atom of society, is the individual. Traditional Western ideas say, no, that's completely wrong, because we know that according to human nature, the reality of human existence. We are social beings, and so the very atom of society itself is not the individual, it is the family. The family is made up of the proton, neutron, and electron of husband, wife, and child, or at the very least, the potential of a child. Because on one hand, you never know, something miraculous could happen and you could have a child, or on the other hand, at the very least, you can adopt a child. So yeah, there is the potential of a child, and that's the basic unit of society, that family. And that family grows and becomes larger and larger. Not only the more kids you have, the more that family grows, but it becomes then an extended family. And from those extended families, we get the basic units of society from our history, ideas of clans or tribes, no matter how you want to put it, and they themselves join together for larger units, and you eventually get a nation. But the point is, again, since your quote unquote progressives think of society as made up of atomistic individuals, they believe that if they can break that gravity that holds those individuals together, that gravity being trust, they can then scatter them to the chaotic wind and take control. But that's not the way it happens if Western society is correct in its estimation of the reality of human nature. They would say, no, if you break down the trust, starting from the large amounts of trust, the easiest to break down, then you're just going to scatter these people who are, by the way, part of the atom of the family, into a smaller unit. And again, I would say your progressives do understand this to some extent because they want to break people into smaller groups. But again, they don't think these smaller groups will have very much effectiveness and then they can take over. But that's not the case. Again, with your idea of neg entropy, these small units actually become more and more ordered. Why? Well, because they know they can trust the people around them. And oh, by the way, there's no more dead weight like your quote unquote progressives that live in our society. Because if you live in that high trust society and they're part of your society, then yeah, you got to drag them along with you. But if you get rid of that whole section and other sections that you consider useless within your group, then yeah, you become more and more ordered. You become more and more efficient because you trust the people around you even more. And quite honestly, I don't see their plan as working, certainly in the way that they structure it, not only because of this atomistic idea of human beings, but also because if you look at history itself, certainly Western civilization history, you can see that that's not the case. Because right now, we live or have lived for quite some time in a large trust society. We have these very large nations, and these large nations exist because we had that high trust, this overarching trusting idea within that society. The last time we saw anything like that outside of the modern period was the ancient period of empire. They had the same way of running their civilization. But here's the thing. In between those two, we have the Middle Ages. And most people see the Middle Ages as being nothing more than a useless, fallow part of history where nothing actually happened. Nothing could be further from the truth. Again, my first degree was in history. I loved medieval history. I think the medievals are actually much more advanced than either the ancients or us. We come in third place, limping along at the back with a broken leg. Why? Because of this very idea that I've been discussing. Since you had those large empires that were broken down into these smaller units, yes, you did have these smaller units, but they were extremely organized units. Extremely organized units because they could trust each other. These ideas of small city states. And quite honestly, it's been a while, but when the internet first started, I used to laugh at these people who would come on the internet and have these statements on message boards saying, well, if it wasn't for, the church, which broke up the empires and the ancient way of thinking, we would be exploring the stars right now. And I would laugh because nothing could be farther from the truth. If those empires still continued up until this day, like say within that Star Trek episode, the original Star Trek, where they went to the planet where the Roman Empire still ruled within the 20th century, what would you be right now? If you existed, you would still be a slave working the field. And why? Because most of the lauded institutions of what we now call civilization grew out of the Middle Ages. The idea of rights itself grew out of the Middle Ages. The idea of the university, yeah, sure, you can go back to the ancients with their idea of academy, but that's quite different. But the idea of university, that grew out of the Middle Ages. The idea of hospitals, that grew out of the Middle Ages. The idea of the scientific method itself grew out of the Middle Ages. And why and how? Well, because you had these smaller units, these smaller nation state units that were extremely compact, extremely dense, and extremely trusting of their own. And so these societies, small pockets of society that were high trust societies, were able to concentrate on developing these kinds of ideas and methods of social interaction, and the better ones of those continued on and expanded throughout the civilization to become what we have today. But again, why am I talking about all this? Why? Because this drastically affects the way that stories are told. There certainly is, I admit, drawbacks to this idea of these more and more organized small units. And that drawback is that trust that exists, which is high trust, only expands as far as your small little borders. You don't trust the other societies around you. You simply don't. It reminds me of the idea, and I call it an idea because I'm not 100% sure that this is historical fact. It might be. But the idea that when Europeans first came and discovered the Americas and started to encounter all of these small Indian tribes, Native American tribes, whatever, when you looked at their languages, each of these tribes, you would see that what they called themselves would translate in their languages to the human being. And this happened over and over again. Each of these tribes would call themselves by their own language the human beings, which the flip side of that is to assume that since you and your tribe are the human beings, the other tribes are not actually human beings. So, at the very least, you don't put your trust in people who are not part of your tribe. This also reminds me of this case study that we read, I think it was back in high school within creative writing class, if I remember correctly. It might have been university, I'm not sure. But anyways, it was from the 80s, and you had these people, I think they were scientists, and they were going to areas of the world where they would find these tribes of people who had never had any contact with the outside world at all. They were small hunter-gatherer tribes that still existed in forests or jungles somewhere. I can't remember if it was South America or Africa or something like that. But anyways, they decided at one point, after contacting one of these small little tribes, to show them a television and to see how they would react to the television. So what they did was they took a television and a VCR and they just taped something off of the television from the local area outside of wherever it was they were. And that thing that they taped was a news story about a guy. He was doing a news story about local farms, so fairly poor local farms. And in the background, you had the backdrop of the farm, and there was like a chicken in the background, representation of a farm, a visual representation for this story. Anyways, so they took this television and this VCR with this news story to these tribesmen, and they set it all up and showed them the news story. Now, they thought these tribesmen, who had no concept of modern technology whatsoever, this is their first interaction really with anybody outside of their tribe, they thought that they would think of television and the ability to tell stories in this way as something magical, when quite honestly, they went in a completely opposite direction. They didn't care about the television. They didn't care about the VCR. They didn't care about the fact that they could see these pictures on this screen. None of that really registered with them at all. What did they break everything down to? Well, they broke it down to trust. So, to the amazement of these scientists, they really weren't shocked by any of the technology. They just said, well, the fella on the screen, we can't understand what he's saying, but obviously he's lying and you should not trust him. And they said, why? Why would you come to that conclusion? And they explained. They came to that conclusion because there was a bird in the background of this guy. Again, this was the chicken that was in the background at this farm. And they said, this bird was alive, but it would not fly away. So obviously, a bird that does not fly away when people are there is a bad omen. And since this bad omen was constantly in the background of this man talking, that was the way of, the gods or the universe telling them that do not trust anything that this man says. But again, my whole point of telling that story is the fact that when they showed them a story, because it was a news story, what did they break it down to? What did this tribe of people who only knew each other as a tribe, what did they break the story down to? They broke it down to the fundamental idea of trust. And I've actually mentioned this on my Wednesday live streams over and over again because I go over the works of Will Eisner every once in a while. He and many, many people before him all see and understand that stories are, at their core, dependent upon trust. There needs to be trust between the writer and the reader in order for the reader to, as we would in modern terms put it, suspend their disbelief enough so that they can engross themselves in either the words on the page or the images that are being shown to them. Because if that trust is not there, you cannot engage with this storytelling, no matter what mechanism it uses, because again, at its basic core, go back to Aristotle, what is story itself? Story is supposed to be a representation of reality. It's supposed to be a faux reality, which you accept for the moment as reality in order to get the meaning out of the entire thing. But if you cannot accept that faux reality as reality, if you do not have trust enough in the author or the presenter in order for you to do that, then you can't engage with this representation of reality as anything more than a representation of something, not as if it was the thing itself. You cannot engage your suspension of disbelief. Therefore, the story to you is not a good story, at the very least. And why in the world would you sit down and subject yourself to not a good story? So again, the point being that Hollywood, and really things like the comic industry or companies like Walt Disney, have destroyed that trust, and therefore their storytelling ability has been destroyed along with it. Now, I want to actually pull a little more out of this by going back to the dichotomy that I mentioned at the first, where you had Richard Meyer from Comics Matter saying, no, we have to actually sustain these industries because there's too much there to abandon the entire thing. And his audience saying, no, we don't trust them anymore. There's something very interesting and very noteworthy at play there, which does add to this entire conversation. So here's the thing. Why in the world was Hollywood able to exist to begin with? Why? Because we had these overarching ideas of trust, not just nationally. It wasn't just the stories were trusted by the nation, but almost by the entire world. Although I'm going to look at this nationally just for a minute, because here's the thing. Richard, much like myself, grew up in a time of high trust. We no longer have that time of high trust. And this is what most people don't quite yet understand. You see, if you go back to the psychological and the way the human mind works and is constructed, to explain the scientific in a poetic way, this is what happens to a human being as they grow up. Your mind, until you're about 19-20, is more or less, we'll call it modeling clay. And within your teenage years, you as an individual have enough experience and freedom so that you can shape that modeling clay into whatever shape you want it to be. But the point is that within those teenage years, that modeling clay also becomes harder and harder. So that by the time you get to be around 20 years old, that modeling clay has then turned into a statue. And that is who you will be mentally for the rest of your life. This, by the way, is why the teenage years are so important. This is why, just to shove a very large aside in here, during those times, you need to have discipline, structure, and order, which again, for your mind is reason and logic. But really, one of those things which gets baked into who you are is how much you trust. Because yes, you can change yourself after you get to the point of, let's say, 20 years old, but it's like chipping away at a statue at that point. It's not like handling modeling clay, which is what it is up until that point. Because again, your personality hardens to this one form. And the thing is that Richard and myself grew up in a society of high trust, and that became part of who we are. The default for us is trust. And we learn the exception to that trust rule within our lives. For Richard, he's always going on about how when he joined the military, he understood by being exposed to liars over and over again, how very easily to pick out what is the truth and what is a lie. Also, I would add, since I have military in my family as well, that when you deal with the military, either are in it yourself or have people that are very close to you that are in the military, you get used to censorship and you get used to propaganda. You know, you get told certain things, certainly I was, where people in the military say, if they tell you X, it's really Y. And when I talk to you on the phone, I can't say X, Y, and Z. Why? Because it would put people in danger. Therefore, there's self-censorship. And if we don't self-censor, someone's going to censor us. So you get used to propaganda, you get used to censorship in some way. But again, for, I would say, Richard, and for people like myself, yeah, we understand these things, but we understand them as exceptions to the rule of trust. And I think that's where Richard is coming from in arguing with his audience. He's coming from that unknown to him basis of trust, which is baked into his personality and his understanding of the exceptions to the rule. And he's saying, no, these things are all exceptions to the rule. You have to go back to that trust at some point within these institutions so that we can go back to them. But here's the problem with a lot of his audience. A lot of his audience have grown up in a society which is no longer high trust. For myself, I really recognize this first and foremost within storytelling around 1996. I started to give up on various forms of entertainment because, quite honestly, I was a story junkie. The first thing that I gave up on was current comic books. Sure, I bought old comic books, read old comic books, bought collections, things like that, but I gave up on newer comics. I also gave up on Star Trek. I think it was around when Enterprise was in its second season. I gave up on watching movies that were comedy-based. And as I gave up more and more on these forms of entertainment, I would find new forms of entertainment that I could trust. Even though they were small and out there, doesn't matter. But the point was, I said to myself at that point, I no longer want these kinds of stories in my life. Because why? Because I don't want to be preached to. And part and parcel of that was I don't want to be preached to because I don't think what these people are preaching is actually true. So I don't trust them anymore. So I would say anybody who's a millennial forward has grown up within this society where, at the very least, storytelling is not trustworthy. And people have begun more and more to recognize this. Why? Because it's propaganda. And not only propaganda, but a certain kind of propaganda. I would say you would qualify it as modern propaganda because, quite honestly, I would say there are good versions and bad versions of propaganda. A good version of propaganda would be the way they dealt with it hundreds of years ago to propagate an idea which you do in a non-rational way. Why? Because usually you're dealing with people who are non-rational. But the whole point of that kind of propaganda is it's not exclusive. That is to say, you can't just have this one idea. You can learn this idea either through this way, if you're not educated enough, or other ways if you become more and more educated. And there are other ways of looking at it, etc., etc. I would say that's a good way of doing things. But modern propaganda is a way of not only teaching people things that get around their rational mind, but they teach it in that way so that they cannot think for themselves because it is only that way that they are allowed to think. There is one idea and one idea only, and you must accept it. Don't think about it. That's what modern propaganda is. And it's funny, I was watching a video from Romanian V just last week. He was talking about going back to 2020, 2021, watching these older videos when the Kung Flu was in full swing, and there was nothing but media spun propaganda everywhere. There was only one way to think. There was only one way to do things. The powers that be declared you could only think this way and do this thing, and that's it. And if you didn't think that way or do these things, then you were considered evil. And V says, you know, Romania, where he lives, actually benefited in a very interesting way from communism. Why? He said, because the people still understand to this day that if you are presented propaganda, that is to say modern propaganda, which is an idea that you must accept this idea and there's no other way to think about this at all, you can't express yourself or even think in a way that contradicts that idea. When you're subject to that kind of a society, what do the people in that society do? Well, he said the Romanian people understand that when they're looking at something and they understand that it is propaganda, telling them that they can only think in one way, you do the exact opposite. That is their default. You do the exact opposite of what you're being told. And that's what's happening right now. You have these people, millennials forward, who have grown up and begun to understand more and more as they grew up, as they became teenagers, as they started to harden their minds into who they were to become, that all of this around them, news stories, television, movies, it's all based upon propaganda. I would say we're probably at about 30% of the population that understands this now, somewhere between 30 and 50. It's getting more and more every year. But the point is that they understand it's propaganda. They understand that propaganda is not true. And this kind of storytelling is everywhere around them. And it has brought them into a mindset where they become people whose default is not to trust. And that default of not to trust has two different aspects to it, both of which affect the way you interact with storytelling. Number one, like V was saying, once you recognize that this is propaganda of the type where you can't have any dissenting opinion or any way of understanding it yourself, you do the exact opposite. And what is all of our storytelling predicated upon right now? Certainly within your large forms of storytelling like Hollywood, like Disney, like industries that are the comic industry, the way that it works right now is for them to shove a whole bunch of advertisement in your face to say, come and see this right now, because they're only going to make the money right now. That's the way entertainment works. That's the way YouTube works right now. If you don't listen to this video within, let's say, the first 2, maybe 3 days that it comes out, YouTube is not going to recommend it to you, ever. Not unless you're going down a rabbit hole listening to my videos. It's only the new that actually sells. But when people are being pushed this idea that you have to see this right now, come and see our movie, come and watch our television show, people are like, no, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm not going to go see your movie just because you tell me to do so. Maybe I'll go watch it for free, or basically for free, some other time in the future. There's no real urgency to me to go see your thing. Therefore, these things are failing. Because part and parcel of how much they can spend on making something like a movie is dependent upon how much they're going to make within the first couple of weeks. And the second part of this entire thing is, since people don't trust these storytellers anymore, what are they doing? Well, they're retreating to their trustworthy tribes of storytelling. They're not giving up on storytelling. It's not having the effect that your quote-unquote progressives actually want it to have, where they say, well, we're the giant institution that tells stories, and yes, they're all propaganda, but you're going to listen to our propaganda because we're the only game in town, because we're the only ones you can trust to actually tell you a story, even though we're not trustworthy, wink, wink. No, people are saying, no, it's not the way things work. No, we're going to retreat to our small niche storytelling where we can actually trust the people who are telling the story. Or at the very least, we can parse through their storytelling easily enough to see which parts are propaganda and which parts aren't. Quite honestly, this is what I do for things like anime and manga. Yes, I know there is a large streak of quote-unquote progressivism within anime and manga. Now, it's Japanese progressivism rather than North American progressivism, but that's the point. Since it's not focusing on my society, and progressivism is all societal based and societal structured, I could pick it out like a sore thumb and say after 3 issues or 3 episodes, yeah, I ain't watching this. Or if I am watching this, those are the absurd parts of it, and I don't really care about those absurd parts of it. Why? Because it's obviously in your face that they're trying to sell you something. It's obvious propaganda. It's obvious quote-unquote progressivism. Or on the other hand, this is why Richard, or I myself, can actually sell books. Why? Because again, we connect with our audience. I try to be as truthful with you as possible as what I am saying. There is a trust that at the very least begins to develop in a way that you trust that I can tell a good story. And so people buy my stories. People buy Richard's stories. And this is where people are going for their storytelling. Again, into these smaller and smaller, compact, and very trustworthy units. And quite honestly, as I said at the beginning, this is a really good mental exercise for me to actually go through. Why? Because I did understand to some extent how successful comic companies did become successful over time. If you look at the history of comics, usually they began by reprinting old stories that didn't cost them anything. And then once they had a footing within the industry, then they more and more began to publish their own kinds of stories. But I didn't quite understand the key between how that worked and what was the element that made those companies work, as opposed to all of these other companies which were flash in the pan companies, especially within the 90s. Things like Continuity Comics, which had spectacular merit according to both its storytelling and its art, but didn't last. Why? Because that element of trust wasn't there. Because they didn't begin small to build up trust. They began large and just blew all their money to begin with, and then they didn't have the stamina to build up the trust necessary for them to build up an audience, for them to become a successful company in itself. And quite honestly, this is why things like Dell Comics, way back in the 60s, when the comic code actually came out, they said, we're not following the comic code because we don't need to. Why? Because we have the Dell standard of merit and trust, which they published at the back of every one of their books, saying, you know us, you, our audience, you know us. You know that we're trustworthy. You know that we will provide good and trustworthy stories to your children. And that's all we need. And all of this is, again, why I concentrate on the idea of hero, not just because I love the idea of hero, which I do, and the ideas which spring from it, or it springs from the ideas of virtue, the ideas of chivalry, all these kinds of things. I do love those ideas, but I think they are the best marketing strategy right now because it's going back to something which is part of the understood human nature, something that is ingrained within every human being, and something that gives them fulfillment because as part of themselves, as self-evident to them, they can trust it very easily when you're telling a story of that kind, a true story of merit, which is based upon the actual ideas of heroism. There's an easy in there for the audience to trust such a character and such a story if you do it right. But finally, I suppose, to get back to the main topic, is Hollywood going to fail? I would say, yeah. Hollywood, like these other large companies like Disney, like these other large industries like the comic industry, they're all going to fail. And if they don't, if they claw their way back to actually existing again so that they become trusted storytellers, it's going to take, at the very minimum, decades. Because quite honestly, it's much harder to build up trust than it is to throw it away. And as I have said over and over again, this is why your quote-unquote progressive storytelling does not work and will die. It's the same reason why progressivism itself does not work and will die. And it's because, at the end of the day, you simply cannot trust them. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels based upon the idea of heroism and merit-based storytelling. And I will be showing you one of the trailers for one of my graphic novels in just a few seconds. And if any of that appeals to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.
No matter how many wars you fight, no matter how much blood you shed, no matter how much rage you loose, no matter how many demons you face, no matter how many companions you lose, no matter if our kingdom falls, I know that you will return to me in honor.